Greetings, conservatives. This is your humble host, John Moraga, and we are back with more ConservaCast. We look forward to keeping you informed with the latest and most relevant commentary of conservative issues. So without further ado, here are a few topics I'd like to discuss.
I have a lot that I want to talk about, but I'm only going to be addressing a few topics today. I want to begin by strongly encouraging conservatives to start planning, to get ready for the day after the election of November 2020. Now, if you've seen some of the previous ConservaCasts and you know my personal opinion, I strongly believe that President Trump will in fact be reelected. Now, you don't have to like him, whether you're a never Trump conservative or whether you're a staunch conservative who supports President Trump. I'm just looking at the numbers, looking at the betting odds, if you want to call it that. And more importantly, looking at his competition. Joe Biden is very, very, very gaffe prone. Even before this happened, he's just pretty notorious for having a number of gaffes. Most recently, I don't want to get into the woods and giving him too much attention, but he made a gaffe about black people, whether or not you were black enough if you didn't vote for him. I mean, he is filled with a number of gaffes. My point is just that looking at the trends, looking at the reality of things, I think President Trump will pull off a re-election. That's not to say that I'm a super strong supporter of President Trump or his detractor. I'm just trying to look at an objective projection of what may happen. He may win the Electoral College by a few points. He may have a landslide. Whatever scenario, I do believe he will be reelected. That being said, for a while now, I've been trying to encourage conservatives to look at the down ballot. U.S. senators, U.S. congressmen, state offices, whatever respective state you live in, to look at those local races, even regional offices that may not be part of the state, sheriffs, whatever offices may be there. So that aside, assuming that President Trump gets reelected, and assuming that there are efforts made to look at the down ballot, what do we do after the election of 2020? How do we plan for certain scenarios? Now, there are two main scenarios that might happen, and then there are other scenarios in between them that may also be a possibility. The first scenario, in any of the scenarios, I believe President Trump will be reelected. So, in one scenario, President Trump is reelected, the GOP wins the Senate, or at least expands their majority, or has a pretty good day for the Senate. They also expand and retake the House of Representatives because currently they don't have it. It's being ran by Nancy Pelosi. And they win a few governor seats, a few state seats, and they expand that territory. The other scenario being President Trump still gets reelected, but the GOP loses the Senate, the U.S. Senate. They do not capture the House of Representatives. The Democrats, the very far left liberal party, takes over some governor seats, local senates, local governance seats, state legislatures, etc. So in either scenario, I still see Donald Trump being reelected, but two very different outcomes down ballot. And of course, without listing all of them and whatever range there are in between scenarios, well, how do we prepare for that? How do we best hunker down and either take some of the wins and use them to our benefit to promote certain legislation, to promote certain types of political gaming, so to speak, or how do we handle losing a lot and licking our wounds and having to get back up and continue the fight? Well, this actually leads me into a different scenario or topic that I want to focus on. But before I get there, let me just stay here. The idea that we gain seats should not give us a false hope. When I say we, obviously I understand the distinction between the Republican Party, the GOP, and conservatives. I get that. I understand that. So before anybody accuses me of just saying, oh, you're using the terms interchangeably, the GOP wins and conservatives win, it's not necessarily true. I get that. Stipulated. But if conservatives are able to as well chime in and expand their territory, then what do we do? How do we utilize that newfound power or expansion of power? In that scenario, I would like to encourage people to think long term in either way. But in that specific scenario, think long term in the sense of which candidates actually came through to pull that off and how did they get there? Was it funding, just a bunch of money thrown into these certain races, or was it more actual grassroots? Was it a combination of the two? How was that obtained so that it can theoretically be replicated, either in that same district or that same state, or to expand it elsewhere for next time? In the other scenario, or extreme scenario, what happened that we did lose that power? Was there not a coherent message? Or was there a coherent message and it just fell on deaf ears? The demographics have changed so much. A younger population has become more involved, which probably isn't going to be the case. But we need to evaluate, how do we assess what happened? And obviously, political insiders, political operatives do this for a living. I'm talking about the average person who may be watching this, the person who may be involved politically, but not necessarily so invested into how the actual political game works. And again, I'm going to talk about that in the next topic. But my encouragement is, do not just fall asleep after the election is called in November of 2020. We only have 6 months plus, a little over 6 months, until Election Day. And 2024 will be upon us sooner than any of us think. It's crazy how 2020 has already sneaked up on us. Snuck up. Snuck up. I don't know. Point is, after all of the hysteria of Donald Trump winning the first time, and all of that dust settled, it took about maybe a year or so, even for conservatives and Republicans to come to grips with, oh my goodness, he's actually our president. We're now looking at his re-election campaign. So the point is just, what do we do? How do we approach things the day after election? The election is called in November 2020. And I want to say, we come in cycles. People have lives, people have jobs, people have children, people have other obligations, people are volunteering. Whatever the case, people are going to school. The point is, all the more that I'm trying to get people to look ahead, to look forward, now more than ever. And we're working towards 2020, but do not lose sight of that day after. What happens the day after? So now I'm going to talk about what is the next area that I want to look at. That is what I've kind of thought of as political puricism, or purism, political purists. I'm in the middle of writing an article now, which may come out in a few days. And it's addressing the litmus tests that some people place on politicians or on the political process. And I'm obviously going to go a little bit more in depth in the article, but just kind of summarizing it. I think especially as with a lot of conservatives, we put a litmus test on certain politicians. If they don't meet certain checkbox areas, then they themselves are not a conservative or worthy of our support. to a much lesser degree, we look at certain political movements or certain political agendas and say, well, it's really only serving what I believe is morally correct in certain areas. And so I'm not going to support it fully. Here's the thing. With conservatives, such as myself and others, we understand that secular politics is not the be-all, end-all. It does not serve our absolute moral authority. The majority of conservatives, at least that I know, if not even statistically, are God-fearing. There is an element that we take into our politics that includes God. And the more informed or the more faith-based of a conservative there is, we understand across the board that ultimately our lives, our salvation, our ultimate destiny will never be fulfilled by a secular government, but only through God and only through our relationship with Him can we find that solace. And so I think, unfortunately, a lot of times conservatives may look to certain politicians or even certain political agendas to fulfill a void that they should have with their relationship with God. Now, we find this very often with the left, the liberals. The biggest, most obvious example of that is usually the environmentalist movement, uh, the global change or um, global warming, global cooling, as it's gone through waves and tides. But climate change is a general term now that they've had to give it because it used to be cooling, then heating, then whatever the case. It's almost like a liberal's religion. That is their supernatural affiliation, so to speak. Now, to be clear, I do not want to say that a never Trump conservative who is God fearing is undermining anything. I have complete empathy with somebody who says, I can never support Donald Trump because he is morally corrupt. He has done things that I cannot wash with my faith. I completely respect that. And I've already talked about that in other ConservaCasts. My point is just that as a whole, putting Trump aside, take Trump out of the equation. I don't want to name names of certain politicians to start, a feud. But I think, unfortunately, there are times that as conservatives, we put too much stock into the the litmus test of certain politicians that we look at. If they bend or they compromise in certain ways in their office, we chalk them off. We throw them under the bus. We just dismiss them. They're no longer conservative. They're no longer part of the program. Well, part of the article that I'm writing, as I said, a little more in depth, is the understanding that human beings are by nature fallible. Individual human beings have a sin nature, and that goes back to our understanding of having a relationship with God, understanding the condition of man, our human nature. If an individual person has a sin nature or can be fallible or imperfect, groups of individuals, a collective body of individuals becomes even more corrupt. And one of the big theses that I'm making in the article is the founders of America understood the inherent evil that lies within the best of men. That was part of what the revolution was based on. It understood the need for checks and balances. Washington had the discernment and wisdom to know he couldn't sit as president for the rest of his life to act as a monarch, as a dictator, as a tyrant. He had a set time of his office. He set that precedent. There were checks and balances within the government, representative government. I mean, without going into a whole history lesson of the founding of the United States, the whole basis of the revolution was on the premise that human nature is flawed and groups of humans, i.e., governments, people with power, are flawed and it can go to their head. And so I think we need to have a little bit, without compromising. This is a tough line to walk, but without compromising our values, without compromising our morals, we still need to have an understanding of human nature, of politicians who, for the most part, have a shared value system with us, but who are a part of a secular system that is still of this world, that is still corrupt, that is still fallen. And when they enter that arena, they will inevitably be tainted with some things. Now, obviously, it is necessary for us to have a discussion if somebody goes so far off the field of what we understand to be right. Obviously, we need to have a disclaimer. This person has now decided to go off the deep end. Again, I'm putting Trump aside. I'm just talking about senators, congressmen, governors, local officials. I'm just talking about a general strategy. If we understand that individuals have a sin nature and are fallen, but even more so, groups of individuals will have an inherent desire to acquire power and abuse that power. It is very important for us to understand how the secular game of politics is conducted. And by no means am I excusing the errors of anybody. My point is just that when we look at the GOP as a whole, the party, the Republican Party, it has embraced non-conservative people. It has tried to be more secular and embracing other people who would support it who aren't necessarily conservative. But as a whole, it has provided a platform for those who do claim to be conservative. It does allow politicians running for office in a secular system to still be conservative, even though they've signed on to or they've become a part of the Republican Party. Please, 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 I cannot stress this enough. I have a long list of disagreements with the Republican Party. I do. But it is still with the understanding that if we go with the baseline, it's a secular system. It's not of God. It will not have truth. It will not provide a system of giving me truth. It's a flawed, secular, worldly, man-made system. That's the caveat. Now, this is not to say, oh, the lesser of two evils. But when you compare the Republican Party with what has become the Democrat Party, there is a gulf of difference. So all this to just say, as conservatives, I don't want to put a litmus test on any certain politician or any certain agenda that doesn't meet 100%, 90%, 80%, and somewhere in between, a little less than that, to say, I will get behind it. I will support him, her, in this system. Because understanding that it's secular, it is a type of game. It is a type of baseball. It is a type of football. It is a type of a group effort, it is a bit familial. And one of the other points that I want to that I will be making in the article that I want to kind of just to throw out here is something familial. Now, this gets kind of personal and a little sensitive, but I think a lot of young men growing up have a moment of rebellion and looking at their fathers, if you're blessed enough to still have your father in your home and in your household, to have those years or times of rebelling against your father. It's natural. Not everybody, but for myself, I remember looking at my father and being very critical of him and just noticing all the flaws that he had. Why don't you do this? Why didn't you do that? You could have done this better. I mean, I was so judgmental to say, "Oh my goodness, you're just such an imperfect father. You're just there's so much more you could have done, you should have done, you know." And obviously in retrospect, as I got older, yeah, there was a lot more that he could have done in a bad way, in a negative way. As I got older, and unfortunately, he passed before I had most of my children, and he was just alive for the for a month or so when I had my first child. But as I got older, as I started having my own children, it's perfectly natural. It's pretty common. You start reflecting, and you start looking at, wow, you know what? My father may not have been perfect, but he was a far greater father than I had given him credit for. He was for the most part, a much better father than most fathers that I've ever known or know now. And I think it's kind of that's given me some perspective on politics, on the secular system. That kind of, you can always expect more of somebody without having the full picture, without knowing what they are doing, what they can do, what they have been doing. It's not a direct analogy or correlation, but I think it would serve a lot of conservatives to look at the greater picture, the bigger picture, with kind of that perspective. Yeah, we can be very judgmental and very critical of the GOP, of other so called conservatives, of other people who are human, who are flawed, who are not perfect. But if we take everything in sum total, if we do not demand a purity test, give them a litmus test that if they do not meet a certain criteria, we will be so dismissive of them. I just think that is something that we need to keep in mind, especially tying it back to the original thing that I was talking about, moving forward after 2020. You know, I think a lot of Democrats right now also think that President Trump will be reelected. I think they're already gearing up for the day after Election Day of 2020 in November. That's all the more reason that I am trying to encourage and get people ready to say, let's hit the ground running. We are going to be hit because I don't know how strong of a candidate Mike Pence will be for 2020. I don't know how strong of a candidate any person running for 2024, excuse me, I meant to say Mike Pence for 2024, or any other person who might be running. I say Mike Pence because he's one of the likely people to come after President Trump since he's the current vice president. But there may be other candidates. Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio. I mean, the whole field that came out last time, I think, are really going to take a consideration for 2024 as well. And just looking at the history of politics, it's going to be an uphill battle. We go from party to party, from movement to movement. Where there was Obama, and then the drastic switch to Trump. We have certain pendulums. My point is just we need to be considerate, we need to be strategic, and most of all, I think we need to be realistic. Our hope is not in a secular system. Our hope should be in God above all else. Once we understand that is our rock and our cornerstone, if we enter a secular system of politics, we don't leave God behind. We don't dismiss God, but we understand that the expectation should not rise to that same level. The last thing I want to talk about, just to kind of complete this circle, is to say that, as many of you may know, all politics are local. Off the top of my head, I don't know who coined that term, but it's a very real term. And what I mean is, again, put President Trump aside, the most effective way that conservatives can impact the 2020 election and elections after 2020 is to stay involved locally. And I mean really locally. The conversations you have with your family over summer break, over Thanksgiving, over the winter holidays, the conversations you have with your friends, your family, the people that are at your church, those are going to be extremely important because then that leads to a chain reaction. Beyond that, get involved in your local politics. It sounds very cliche, it sounds very stereotypical, but trust me, the Democrat Party has far more of an operation. The liberals have a much more organized system than the GOP and conservatives. I mean, the closest thing where there was an organized effort that really had an impact was in 2010, the Tea Party movement that really started to get on fire. That's kind of died down. There are still a lot of people who are motivated by that. But as a whole, as a sustained effort and as a sustained and consistent system, I remember just a few years ago having somebody knocking on my door and didn't know my party affiliation, coming to campaign for a Democrat local office, a Democrat candidate of a local office. Granted, I live in California, so that's the assumption. But just the fact that there was no Republican representative coming out, this was a volunteer. I didn't answer the door because I didn't want to answer the door. It wasn't the police. It wasn't anybody. I saw that they had some flyers. I could care less about what somebody wants to do with a political flyer. I just ignored it. They went away. They left the flyer and they left the material on my door or at my doorstep, and it was for a Democrat candidate. I saw nothing of the Republican candidate. Now, that technically might be because of funding. Maybe that candidate, the Democrat candidate, was much more funded than the Republican candidate. But all the more reason, whether it's funds or whether it's just the time, go find your local candidate. Look at your districts, whether it's for the state or for the federal offices. Go find who it is and try and get out there. Go to their offices. Help volunteer at their phone banks. Do certain blogs for them. Go onto social media and repost what they have. We live in an age now where the print media is a dying industry. Everything is online now. Say that hyperbolically, but a lot of it is true. Share certain things, tag certain people. It may sound very useless, but trust me, if you're not doing it, the Democrats are. The far left liberals are doing it. And whatever 1-200 votes they might get, 10,000 votes that they might get out of those efforts, we need to be countering that. So things are very local. You can have more of an impact than you think. Not just voting, but messaging, campaigning, volunteering, getting that voice out, making the people in your home, your family, your friends, at your church, as I said, encouraging them. It's not a lost cause. It's only a lost cause because we've started to become apathetic. We've started to concede certain areas, and it's a wounded animal in the wild who's just said, I'm done. rather than getting up and running and making things happen more proactively. So that's going to do it for me today, guys. I want to encourage you. Please check out our website, conservativescorner.com, conservativescorner.com. Please subscribe to our channel, check out our social media, and by all means, please send me a message of any recipes that you might have, something unique that you might want me to look at and possibly feature. In the near future, I'll do another recipe, but I think that's kind of fun to kind of get people's minds off of things, of some stress. But thank you for watching once again. God bless you. God bless America.
Thanks for joining us once again, and we hope you'll invite your friends and family to join us in our efforts to champion conservatism for generations to come.